May he have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. May desert tribes bow down before him and his enemies lick the dust. May the kings of Tarshish and of the coastlands render him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring gifts. May all kings fall down before him. All nations serve him. Welcome back to the Dominion Podcast. I'm Jeremy Boyd.
I'm Alex.
And we're very glad to be here today with a special guest.
Yeah.
So I don't know, do we want to skip all of the banter and just go right to the introductions or what?
All the childish banter. We're going to have to act like adults now.
Well, we're paying for his time, so if we just talk for 10 minutes about nothing, it's just costing us money.
Yeah, well, we are, in all seriousness, very happy, delighted, honored to welcome to our show Dr. Michael Wagner. He is an independent researcher and writer and a columnist for the Western Standard. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Alberta. He has written books on Christianity and politics in Canada, which we will reference throughout this interview, and the Alberta Independence movement. He and his wife have 11 children, and they have been home educating for over 30 years. That is definitely the most impressive part of that bio, for sure.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for joining us, Michael. We're honored to have you.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So that did spark, we have to say something about KCCS.
That's right.
So one of the other bonds that Jeremy and I share is that we are on the founding board of a classical Christian school here in Peterborough, which we started in 2019, Kawartha Classical Christian School. Again, we recognize that, the public school is just not an option for our children. And my wife's a teacher, and we had some other families come together. So we share your commitment to educating our children, I guess, is where I'm going with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have kids, so I'm just like the hype guy. I'm the hype guy on the board.
Yeah, you do a lot that we're thankful for. Well, as I was saying before the show, I first came across your writing in a book that you wrote on the Broken Covenant, the Anglosphere's Broken Covenant, and it was something that I believe Pastor Douglas Wilson referenced in his blog. And I picked up the ebook of that. I would commend that to our listeners as well. We're going to leave a link to a bunch of these things in the show notes. But as I was saying to you before, it was not just the historical facts that I was ignorant to. It was the entire paradigm of a nation being an objective covenantal unit that has objective responsibilities to God. And when you say that out loud, it sounds very silly that was news to me. I mean, we're Christians, so we think that all creatures have a duty to God, and we think that nations are a real thing instituted by God, and so it makes sense that they would have particular duties towards God. And I'd like to, get into that in a second, but this is my first introduction to your thought. And since then, I've followed you quite a bit in the Western Standard. Really appreciate the work they've done over the last couple of years in general, and you in particular. I know that you are quite involved now in the Alberta separation movement. You've written on this. You provide kind of an intellectual, historical, theological basis for the movement, which I've appreciated. But one of the places I thought we could start, actually, is thinking through the historic Canadian Christian identity. And for the reason I'm so eager to talk to you about this is that you go back before the foundation of the Dominion of Canada, the forming of the Dominion of Canada. And the reason I think this is helpful is that not only do most Canadians have no understanding of our Christian history, but they think that the history of Canada begins in, 1867, and that all of a sudden as if our legal tradition and our customs and our culture and our values, sprang up out of the dirt of Upper and Lower Canada. But that is not true whatsoever. So maybe just generally speaking, Michael, you could give us a bit of a flyover of Canada's Christian past, even beginning before the formation of the Dominion?
Sure. Well, Canada was founded essentially by France and Britain, especially Britain. And both of those countries were officially Christian countries at the time that they founded Canada. So, of course, first we had New France, and France itself was a very Catholic country. And, of course, Quebec was, famously Roman Catholic for centuries, until the 1960s, was one of the most committed Roman Catholic communities on earth. And so, obviously, Christianity in the Roman Catholic sense had a very firm position in Quebec for centuries. And of course, the rest of Canada was founded by Britain. Now, Britain was an officially Christian country. I mean, technically it still is, although you wouldn't know it. Like we have the Church of England as the official church. And then, of course, the Church of Scotland in Scotland. That was the country that founded Canada. So you have countries that are officially Christian with a Christian background to their political and legal systems, setting up those systems here in Canada. So they could only be Christian if they're starting from the Christian foundation of those countries. And in fact, a couple of the maritime countries, colonies, I can't remember which ones, it was New Brunswick and one of the others, they had established Church of England as their established church as colonies as well.
Oh, so, I did not know that.
That was before. Yeah, so a couple of those maritime provinces, colonies at the time, had established churches, this Church of England as their established churches. So that could only be Christian. And then in Upper Canada, which is Ontario, and I think Lower Canada too, up until the 1850s, there was land set aside by the government for the support of Christian ministers. It was called, I remember the name offhand, what that was for, but that was for several years. The governments had land set aside specifically to support ministers in what's now Ontario and Quebec. So this very much shows how much there was an integration between Christianity and the state. And of course, we had laws. The colonies had laws protecting the Lord's Day, and that would play into later Canada itself having a Lord's Day Act until the Charter came along. But the specific reason for having Lord's Day protection in the law is because we were a Christian community. I mean, the Lord's Day is just one of the 10 Commandments, but it wasn't like a secular day of rest. It was specifically protection for the Lord's Day. So we had these explicitly Christian laws and policies in our country right from the very beginning. And in fact, our definition of marriage until 2003 in Canada was an explicitly Christian definition of marriage that was based on a British court decision from the 1800s before Canada was independent. There's a court decision that I can't remember the exact definition, but it's, marriage is a man and a woman. Marriage in Christendom, it said, is a man and a woman, one man and one woman for life. And it had the word Christendom right in there. And that was our definition of marriage until the Ontario Court of Appeal, overthrew that definition of marriage in 2003. And of course, it would later be changed by the Parliament as well. But we had these very explicitly Christian policies. And in one of my books, I talked too about not only Lord's Day, but Ontario's public education system had a lot of explicit Christian content right from the 1800s onwards, again, until the Charter was brought in. It had, religious exercises, opening and closing with Lord's Day or prayer, and also some explicitly Christian content in terms of what was taught in the schools. Now, as throughout the 20th century, before those were returned, there were some schools that weren't implementing those anymore. Some of that would fall away, but in certain rural areas, they still had them, and that's why eventually those policies would be overturned on the basis of the Charter. But still, when you look at these communities in English-speaking Canada, they had explicitly Christian policies and laws, whether it's the definition of marriage or their education system or the Lord's Day Act. These are, it's very clear. Like, how could someone look at these things and not see Canada as a Christian country originally?
Yeah,
the Christian law policies. So I guess I'll just stop at that point right now.
No, that's enormously helpful, and I think part of the cultural revolution in Canada, as in all places, is a total re-envisioning of history. Like it's a completely fabricated narrative about one's history in order to perpetuate whatever political goals or ends people are seeking, and the same is true in Canada. I mean, until I, to be honest, started reading your works in particular, and a couple other colleagues of mine mentioning things, I didn't realize that I always thought America was explicitly Christian and Canada was always nominal. That's how the story in my head my whole life. But I also read, I believe, is it Mark Knoll's book, What Happened to Christian Canada? And I think he's an American. I don't think he's a Canadian. Yes. And
he's American.
And he's like, what happened to you guys? And in the introduction, he goes through all these statistics, and I believe that he actually asserts that Canada was arguably more Christian in a variety of metrics than America was. But this is not the story. The story that contemporary Canadians believe is that America is a Bible-thumping, conservative, right-wing, wingnut place. We've always been moderate, secular, pluralistic in our nation. And it's a complete, if what you're saying is true, that's a complete fabrication.
Yeah, it's odd that people would say that, because in your talk that I was listening to, you mentioned that what happened with the charter was actually a part of a revolution.
Yes,
like there was a political revolution in Canada that people just didn't realize. If we've always been nominal, there would have been no need for a revolution, right?
That's a good
they're
point.
pushing against something explicitly Christian, and I think that couldn't have happened if the people hadn't already sort of given up on the faith to some degree. I mean, we know the communists are pretty dogged, and they go after the things they want pretty hard, but it probably wouldn't have worked if people were still, steadfast in their faith.
So let's circle back to the
Sorry,
culture.
I'm getting ahead?
No,
All right.
that's fine. That's good. But maybe going back even further than this, Michael, could you just even briefly explain what is the Solemn League and the Solemn League and Covenant? Because this will come up again, I believe, when we talk about cultural apostasy. Could you just briefly explain that?
Sure. Well, like Scotland itself, when it became Presbyterian in the 1500s, I think in 1581, it created what was called Scotland's National Covenant. Then they renewed that covenant in 1638 because the King of England, Charles I, was trying to force Anglican religious rituals on Scotland, which was Presbyterian. So Scotland kind of recommitted itself to the Presbyterian faith in fighting Charles I with the National Covenant of 1638. Then in England, there was also in Parliament, the Parliament was dominated by Puritans, where Charles I was very much Anglican and wanted to force Anglican things. So civil war broke out between Parliament and Charles I, and Parliament wanted a treaty with Scotland so that Scotland would help Parliament against the king. And so Scotland agreed to that. That'd be the League, but they also wanted it to be partly a religious covenant. So the English Parliament and Scotland made this covenant, the Solemn League and Covenant, in 1643, to commit their countries to God and to reform their churches according to the Bible, so that their country would be covenanted, with God itself. And I just want to throw in here, though, like this was based on Old Testament examples. Like in the Old Testament, there's various times of revival in Israel where the king will call the people together and they'll make a covenant to follow God all over again. And so the Presbyterian and Protestant theology of the 17th century was that this was viable. This was something that we were to do as Christian nations. So they thought they believed that they were doing that in accordance with Scripture, and I agree with that. So their nation, they committed Britain, Scotland, Ireland, and England, made this covenant, the Solemn League and Covenant with God in 1643. To make a long story short, eventually, they would turn away from God. Charles's son, Charles II, would come into power in about 1660. He then declared the covenants to be illegal and started persecuting the people who wanted to uphold it. And so the Covenanters, per se, the Scottish Covenanters in particular, are kind of better known in church history as people who from the 1660s to the 1680s were persecuted. Many of them were killed and exiled and so on. And then in 1688, William III, William of Orange, came over to England, overthrew what was then James II, because Charles I died about in the 1680s, and his brother James II took over, but was even worse. Anyway, William III came in, overthrew the Anglican persecution of the Presbyterians, and then he kind of partially reestablished the Protestant dominance in Scotland and England. Like he made England, of course, the Church of England again dominant in England, and the Church of Scotland was somewhat Presbyterian, but not according to the covenants. And this is the problem, that William III, overthrew the tyranny, so it was a good thing. That was a glorious revolution, but he didn't reinstate the full attainments of the Protestant of what was called the Second Reformation in the 1640s with the Solemn League and Covenant and the doctrinal and civil attainments at that time. So Britain was a more of a free country again with William III, and we had the Bill of Rights in 1689. But it wasn't a full recommitment to the covenanted obligations of the Solemn League and Covenant. So in that sense, people like me think that England has been apostate since that time to a certain degree. And then the countries that England settled, like Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, these people came from a covenanted country to settle new countries. And so their countries kind of started off not as good as they should have because they were partly defective because of the reestablishment. This revolution settlement of 1690 didn't reestablish the full commitment to the covenants that it should have. So I hope I didn't go too far, but that's kind of in brief what's going on there.
That's fantastic. And I think for those listening, if this seems like a strange new category as it did to me, if we just think in biblical categories, part of the reason this feels strange is we are so inundated by secularist categories that we think, forget about nations, on an individual level, most people grow up in our society thinking that it's possible to be irreligious, right? Which is a complete myth. I mean,
the government is just the group of people that build the roads and, have an army.
Yeah.
That's all they are, right?
But even apart from the state, just think about the individual.
Yeah.
We must, as Christians, reject the idea that anyone is, in a fundamental sense, irreligious. Everyone worships. It's either you worship the true and the living God through his son, or you worship an idol, right? In your own image, essentially. And well, if that's the case, then is a nation capable of being religiously neutral? And if the answer is no, then it's not a matter of like, well, can you make a covenant? It's a covenant is simply acknowledging formally which God you will serve. So then it's not strange or just a weird kind of ritual tied to old covenant customs. It's actually just basic biblical theology that if a nation is a legitimate thing, and if all things must worship either God or idols, then the choice is between, for a nation, a God or an idol. And once I kind of process this for myself, this, we'll kind of circle in the conversation back to this. This makes sense of the West. Because as we talk about on often our podcast, what else can make sense of the suicide of the West but idolatry? Yeah. Like the West has the most prosperity, the most peace in the history of the world, the most flourishing that any human society has ever experienced, and it's not even worth comparing. Like the poor, basically the poorest among us live better than kings of 4 centuries ago, and a longer life expectancy and less war and conflict and violence and all of this. But we have self-destructed. Like we were not conquered, we surrendered. And if you were to analyze Western society according to, a paradigm of apostasy and the characteristics that Isaiah and Jeremiah and the prophets speak of in reference to apostate Israel, it maps on perfectly, right? It's like anyways, we don't need to go all there now, but that historical piece that you mentioned is what really launched me in this kind of biblical theological paradigm. So that's super helpful. We'll make a link to that book. People can dive in deeper to that. So
can I just jump in something?
Yes, please.
Like you're talking about, like you mentioned, it's impossible for a country to be neutral. Like every country, every political system is based upon a particular worldview.
Yes.
And so get rid of the Christian worldview, you're not making it neutral.
No.
You're bringing in something else.
Yes.
And something that's important here too is Romans 13 says that the civil magistrate is a minister of God, to reward those who do good and to punish those who do evil. Well, how does he know what's good and evil? Well, he has to be guided by the Bible.
That's right.
So a civil magistrate, is a minister of God who's guided by God's word as to what he's to do. So when he turns away from that, he's not becoming neutral. He's turning against God. You know what I mean? He's using his office against God. So for me, like I find Romans 13 is really helpful for me to understand that the civil magistrate is supposed to be a minister of God, and if he's not doing that, he's not fulfilling his role. He's turned to a different God in a sense, like you mentioned. He's serving an idol.
Yes, and the idea of a neutral state is just a myth. It's not as though Christians are saying we shouldn't have a neutral state. We're saying we don't. It's never existed.
It doesn't. Yeah, it's not a thing.
And instead of demons and ourselves, we should worship God.
Yeah.
And so this is a good segue then to what you have described as, and others as, really a cultural revolution. That Canada's founding was based on a Christian worldview, at least explicitly.
Yes.
Our legal customs and our traditions, and even the moral ethos and imagination of the people was profoundly Christian through and through.
Yeah.
And outside of Quebec, it was Protestant. And so that's, that's a different conversation. But it's interesting even today when, the nationalist movement is trying to pair, French and English together because they're both white, as if the bonds, as if skin, melanin unites people. It's like, how different Quebec is from the rest of Canada?
Yeah, because Catholicism is very different than Protestantism.
Exactly.
Like, that's the reason. Yeah.
And they refer to them, I only learned recently, they refer to themselves as a Quebec nation. Like, they see themselves as a nation. So that's a whole rabbit trail we don't have to go down. But the Canada that I grew up in outside of Quebec was English Protestantism in a worldview, basically. Mm-hmm. So you write about the Cultural Revolution, and initially I wanted to start with the Charter in this discussion, which I'd like you to get to. But in reading your book again this morning about the history of the Christian right in Canada, you begin, and I think end, noting that one of the impetus for that movement was the sexual revolution. And I would like you to touch on that, because I'll let you touch on that first, and then I might make some comments on that. But this was interesting. So the sexual revolution took place well before the Charter and the updating to our legal system and stuff. So what role do you see that playing in Canadian culture?
Yeah, well, actually, the sexual revolution affects all of the Western nations to one degree or another.
Yes.
So Canada's not unique. Like, Canada's just one aspect of that. Mm-hmm. But what was important in Canada and how it worked out was that Pierre Trudeau, when he was prime minister in 1969, brought in what was called the Omnibus Bill to make reforms on various laws. But among those were legalizing homosexuality and to a certain degree legalizing abortion, like not complete abortion, but having it done in a certain restricted sense, allowing it to a certain degree that was never allowed before. So this was kind of, this was showing a major change in Canadian society, because we'd had essentially Christian-based social policies until 1969. And by allowing homosexuality and abortion to a certain degree for the first time, this would lead to, over the next several decades, to a point where we'd end up with abortion on demand, with 1988, the Morgentaler decision, and eventually the legalization of same-sex marriage. So this is like this is a turning point in Canadian history from 1969 until 2005. We went from being an essentially Christian nation in the sense of a worldview basis for our social policies, and from 2005 onward, we have almost no Christian basis to our social policies. That was the period where it turned away, and then that book talks a lot about how there were Christians who fought against those laws, fought against opening up abortion, and fought against the homosexual rights movement, because once they legalized homosexuality, that's not the end point, that's the beginning point. So once they're legalized, then they want various laws in place to defend against discrimination, and ultimately leads to the legalization of same-sex marriage. It doesn't happen, it always happens incrementally. They never say right from the start, this is the full deal we want. They always want incremental changes, because it's easier for people to accept incremental changes, like the frog in the water pot, and as the water gets hotter, they can, they don't jump out. It's a gradual thing. To a certain degree, it was like that with abortion too, in the sense that, Trudeau brought in a less restrictive abortion law so that women could get abortions only in certain hospitals with therapeutic abortion committees. So in the 1970s, for example, into the 80s, there'd be tens of thousands of abortions every year. But even that was not free enough for the feminists. They wanted a completely free abortion regime without any restrictions whatsoever. And so through the Morgentaler decision of 1988, where the Supreme Court struck down even the mild restrictions that we had at that time, that led us to a completely open abortion regime. Like, as I understand it, Canada is the only country in the world without any restrictions on abortion legally whatsoever. And that's because of the 1988 Morgentaler decision. The Mulroney government did try to bring in some restrictions after that, leading up to 1990-91, but that law failed, and so there's nothing significant that's been tried since that time. But this is the cultural revolution you're talking about, where we went from a country where abortion was illegal and homosexuality was legal. We had, protected the traditional family. That was our way of life. And then once we start loosening those restrictions, one thing leads to another, to a point now where, I'm sure you heard of Barry Neufeld, in BC, he's being fined $750,000 just for speaking out against, the more recent views on sexuality with the transgender movement and stuff. So we went from having those kind of things being illegal to now it's illegal to speak against them in certain contexts. So we've had a complete revolution in our society from one worldview to now we have a dominant progressive or secular worldview that does not like Christianity and will punish Christianity in certain contexts.
I know we haven't gotten to the charter yet, but do you think that the sexual revolution was really what they were trying to get to with the charter? Was the charter just a tool to open the door for all that stuff, or was there something else that they had in mind? Because it seems to me like we're in like a Psalm 2, they're saying, let us burst their bonds apart. Like they just don't want any of these restrictions. And so I don't know if there's more of if they're more connected or what. Maybe you can tell us a bit about that.
Like I think the charter project was actually much bigger than just the sexual revolution. I think Pierre Trudeau's agenda with the charter. I mean, we have to keep in mind the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was very much Pierre Trudeau's idea right from the very beginning. He was the one who proposed it in 1968 when he was Justice Minister, and the government actually published his proposal as a book. And then, of course, shortly after that, he became Prime Minister. But the Charter of Rights from beginning to end was Pierre Trudeau's project, and he wanted to fundamentally change Canada. He did not like Canada the way it was. If you want to change a country, you change the Constitution because the Constitution is its foundational document. He wanted to fundamentally change Canada. And, the sexual revolution would have been perhaps one component of that, but it wasn't the primary driver. It was just one component. He wanted to fundamentally change the country in many ways. So when he brought in the charter, that gave tools to the left to bring their agenda forward. Like it gave them tools to use legally and politically to advance their agenda. So, it's possible that without the charter, we'd still have some, abortion and homosexual rights, but they would not be to the same extent that they are because, and especially with the homosexual rights movement was able to use the charter. I mean, a lot of the achievements they had were through court cases more than through policy changes by governments. If you want to, it's a lot easier for them to win a court case than to win an election. And I mean, this was part of Trudeau's thing. Trudeau wanted to advance left-wing changes in Canada. And he saw from the American example that if you put judges in charge of political decision-making, you can advance the country in a left-wing direction much more quickly because you don't have to deal with the voters. You don't have to deal with elections. You get, judges to make the decision and it's final and it can't be changed. So the charter was a broad project that included kind of a component that would advance the sexual revolution.
So I want to come to the charter next, but before we do, when you made that comment or when I read you just lay out the history of the Christian and the Canadian rights opposition to this revolution, and you touched on abortion and homosexual marriage, it sparked in my mind a book that I read on Christian distinctiveness in early Rome, I think, is Larry Hurtado. And it's a fascinating book from a historian. And two of the kind of distinctives of the Christians in Rome, in Roman society, were their commitment to the sanctity of human life, particularly with neglected, or I should say abandoned, discarded infants, and Christian sexual norms. Specifically that the man himself was called to be chaste and pure and faithful to his wife. That was expected of the wife towards the husband societally, but it was not at all expected of the husband towards the wife. And so it was interesting, of all the things that you had mentioned that sets Christians apart at the formation, but this is exactly the opposite of what the Cultural Revolution was in Canada. And it's interesting that the so-called progressive moral evolution is actually a devolution into barbarism and anti-civilizational behaviors.
No, we're seeing that now, right?
Yeah, and it's framed as this moral progress and this enlightenment and this emancipation from the Dark Ages, but it's like, wow, that maps onto the the world of pagans.
Yeah.
And
it's a restriction. It's a restriction in the sense that righteousness does restrict your behavior.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think what it also demonstrates, again, that when we use the word cultural revolution, we think of that even in biblical categories, that a culture is, as we say, religion externalized, right? As that phrase goes. And so a cultural revolution, if it's real, is really a religious revolution. It's not just the external norms and stuff, but there's a deeper shift that's taking place. And I think that you were alluding to another goal in mind. And so partly when people like Michael break down the history of these things, we know it's helpful, but we know in one sense there's a bigger picture. There's a bigger battle taking place. We don't wage war against flesh and blood, that these things are ultimately an assault on God. It's an assault on his word. It's an assault on his creation and creational norms. And I think, in 1969, it's actually, it's funny, the progressivism really only works in Christian societies. Like the logic of progressivism doesn't work in Muslim countries. It doesn't even work in like Hindu countries and stuff. Like progressivism is a Christian heresy, and it relies on Christian commitments to compassion and true human equality and dignity. And it just hijacks the language to import a kind of pagan barbarism.
It's parasitical in a sense, but it does require the host to kind of have certain characteristics, which you only get in a Christian culture.
And I think now that the revolution has been taking place for 50 years plus, the veneer is worn off. It's like, oh, I thought this was about just respecting everybody. And now we mutilate our kids. You can kill a baby up until they're born or after. Yeah. It's like, hold on a second. Like, that's not the story that we were told. And anyways, that was a bit of a rabbit trail on my part.
Just ranting. It's
bloviating
and foaming at the mouth over here. But we should probably let our guest respond to something there.
Welcome to the Alex Show. but maybe you could, with that smooth segue, you could talk about the charter, because definitely another insight that you brought, and actually I had several other pastors and friends mention from the conference that it was shocking to hear that the charter was an anti-Christian document or undermined our Christian worldview, because I'm one of those people who were like, hey, even our charter references the supremacy of God and the rule of law, and these are Christian ideas. And could you just explain that thesis, that the charter was really a means of undermining Canadian Christian identity?
Sure. Like, I'll start with the preamble. Like, the preamble does mention that Canada recognizes the supremacy of God. And God was actually put in the preamble specifically because of Christian activism. You have to remember, like Trudeau, like as I mentioned, proposed the charter in 1968, and it was not well received necessarily. There was a lot of opposition to it, and it, for several years during the 70s, there was occasionally be parliamentary hearings and stuff, but there wasn't enough momentum, there wasn't enough support to get it in, and it wasn't until he was reelected in 1980 that he was really committed to put it in. Now, it was Trudeau against the provinces. A lot of the provinces didn't want the charter, and so he needed it to be as popular as possible. He did not like the idea of putting God in the preamble, but one of his MPs convinced him, the kind of people that support having God in the preamble are also kind of like conservative supporters. So they're the kind of people that Trudeau needed to support the charter to overcome the opposition from the premiers. So Trudeau reluctantly agreed to put God in the preamble as a way of generating more support for the charter, so it'd be more likely to succeed. And so God was put in the preamble, but it's not something that the judges can rule on per se. I mean, it's the preamble is supposed to kind of set the stage for interpreting the charter, but realistically, like the charter itself includes section 27, which says that the entire charter must be interpreted in light of Canadians' multicultural heritage, their multicultural heritage, not their Christian heritage. So when the very first major Supreme Court decision on religion came to be, that was the Big M Drug Mart decision in 1985. That's the one that struck down the Lord's Day Act. The judges specifically dealt with the preamble and said that the God in the preamble is not the Christian God. It's a multicultural God, because Canada is a multicultural country. So right from the very beginning of the interpretation of the charter, it was declared not to be the Christian God. And then, like the Lord's Day Act itself shows what was about to happen, because the Lord's Day Act was an explicitly Christian law, which was what's interesting with that too is the Lord's Day Act was challenged at the Supreme Court level in 1963. There was a couple of guys with a bowling alley open on a Sunday. They were charged for violating the Lord's Day Act. They took it to the Supreme Court saying this violates our religious freedom. And the Supreme Court in 1963 said, no, Canada is a Christian country. We've always had Lord's Day protection. And so we cannot conceive that the Lord's Day Act would be contrary to Canadians' conception of freedom of religion. That's 1963. 22 years later, in the meantime, we've adopted the Charter in 1982. Now the Supreme Court says we cannot have laws that are based on Christianity. Like the Supreme Court said that the Charter of Rights is basically like leaves a clean slate now, a clean slate for the Supreme Court to make decisions. And so they're not going to have allow for Christian, specifically Christian laws or religious laws in Canada. So they had to strike down the Lord's Day Act because it was based on Christianity, not on the new concepts of freedom of religion with a secular basis to them. So that was the first major religious decision under the Charter, gets rid of the Lord's Day Act because it's Christian. And then, as I mentioned earlier too, like Ontario in particular had Christian religious exercises and religious teaching. And because of the Charter at the Ontario Court of Appeal level, the religious exercises were put out of Ontario schools in 1988 in the Zilberberg decision. And then the actual content, some religious content, was put out of Ontario schools in 1990 with the Elgin County decision. And both of those decisions by the Ontario Court of Appeal were on the basis of the Charter. The Charter does not allow Christian content in public education or, the Christian religious exercises. And then, as I mentioned earlier too, then in 2003, that same court, Ontario Court of Appeal, threw out Canada's traditional definition of marriage because it was a Christian definition of marriage. So in each of these cases, and there's others, including, town councils opening with the Lord's Day Act and things like that. In every case, the Christian content is thrown out because of the Charter. It violates the Charter's concept of freedom of religion. So the adoption of the Charter meant that Canada's concept of freedom of religion changed fundamentally from a Christian conception of freedom of religion to a secular conception of freedom of religion, and therefore all these Christian-based policies and laws had to be struck down on the basis of the Charter. So the Charter clears out, explicitly Christian laws and policies and Christian participation in that sense in the public square. And actually, this is confirmed. Like my book, the book that I did on that, I wrote in 2012, and this was confirmed in 2018 with the Trinity Western decision. I don't know if you guys followed that, but Trinity Western University in BC was trying to set up a law school, and they had the approvals from the various law societies originally, but then the law societies of BC, Ontario, and Nova Scotia revoked their approval of that law school because Trinity Western University had a student code of conduct that was based on Christian principles. And among those principles was that a student could only engage in sexual activity if they're in a traditional marriage, not a same-sex marriage or any other context. So those three law societies saw that as discrimination against homosexuality. To make a long story short, this issue went to the Supreme Court of Canada. And the Supreme Court, like the law societies, are given their authority to approve or disapprove of a law school from the provincial governments. So the law societies are private organizations, but when they're accrediting a law school, they're doing it as a government institution, as a government functionary. So they were acting in the capacity of state organizations when they denied accreditation to that law school. So the law school should have been the one protected by the Charter, because the Charter is supposed to protect us from the government. So those law schools should have lost the case because Trinity Western University's freedom of religion was being denied. But instead, the Supreme Court turned it on its head and said, no, that Christian code of conduct for students was so egregious that the law schools were justified under the Charter in not accrediting the university. So it's so anti-Christian, I guess.
It sounds like a real conflict of interest there, doesn't it? The very institutions that are now the ones essentially making law are the ones that get to gatekeep who is able to practice law. So it's like how are they actually going to be able to with justice decide between cases when they're setting the rules at the beginning as to who can even study it. So it's a real conflict of interest. I had a thought or a question about the Charter itself. Is the reason that it is so the government is able to use it against us, as we saw in COVID? It did not protect the people during the lockdowns and all of that. Is that because before it was understood that those rights that we have were not actually bestowed by the government, but they were bestowed by God and only recognized by the government. And now with the charter, what we're saying is these rights that we have are actually given to us by the government. And if that's the case, then the government is actually able to take them away. Is that part of the flaw in the charter that has allowed the government to oppress people and take away people's rights?
Like I can't answer categorically on that. Like there's a sense in which like our concept of rights protection did change with the charter. Like before the charter, our rights were protected. Like before the charter was instituted, Canadians' individual rights were protected as well as or better than any country in the world. Like Trudeau sold it to us that, our rights are not protected. But I mean, what country in the world before 1982 had a better protection for individual rights than Canada did? Our rights were protected in the British Canadian system, which is unwritten rights. It's kind of a common law approach where you have these historic rights, and if they get challenged, then they go to the court and see. So the charter was a completely different way. The charter was Trudeau's idea was to adopt the American system, where you have an explicitly enumerated list of rights that are protected. He said this is the only way we can guarantee our rights. But then they put in the reasonable limitations clause at the beginning of that. You have these rights subject to reasonable limitations. And it's the reasonable limitations clause, I think, that has been used, in the COVID situations, that we'd claim our right. The government would bring in these restrictions. People would say, I have these rights under the charter. And the courts would say, well, those rights have reasonable restrictions. And because the courts were in favor of the restrictions, because the courts were in favor of the COVID restrictions, and so that they were able to interpret the reasonable limitations clause as allowing for those COVID restrictions to be enforced and to be legal. Mm-hmm. So I can't say categorically, like with your question, that was the charter that led to that situation, because it's possible that with the decline of our country, even without the charter, those restrictions might have been upheld, because I think they were upheld. Like Britain had restrictions as well, and they don't have a charter. So I don't want to blame the charter specifically for that, but the charter does have a reasonable limitations clause in it for rights, so that they were able to do that without much difficulty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is. I remember early on being in a meeting with pastors and lawyers who I will not mention, and we were all kind of
super secret.
Yeah, we were all very hopeful. That we were literally like praying for and excited about who was going to get the first court case, because we would have a charter challenge, and we would, this thing is so blatantly a violation of our charter protected rights that this thing's going to be over, and we're going to be the heroes. Not that we be the heroes, but that this is, it's a good thing, the tickets that we got and all this stuff. That was proven very wrong. Yeah.
Unfounded optimism.
Unfounded optimism. So you referenced there multiculturalism. And this is kind of another component of the Cultural Revolution that many Canadians, when they think of the word multiculturalism, they think of just, probably generally a respect and tolerance of different cultures or something like that.
Being able to go get a shawarma.
Yeah, or
anywhere.
Being able to go get a shawarma. And on one level, I mean, obviously as Christians, we believe in the Imago Dei, that every human being is created in the image of God and, has an inherent dignity and worth because of that. But the formal doctrine of multiculturalism in our legal system was do you think that was another, like, I want to say pillar, almost what's the opposite of a pillar, like a depth charge, beneath our Canadian culture and identity as a Christian country? Do you see a connection there?
Like in a sense, like you said, like you mentioned, the term multiculturalism itself can be used in different contexts.
Yes.
But it definitely has been used to undermine like our Christian identity as a country. Mm-hmm. Like because first we were a Christian country, then we had to bring in this concept of multiculturalism, which means, well, we can't claim to be a Christian country anymore because we're a multicultural country. Mm-hmm. And it's especially vicious, I think, in the charter itself. As I mentioned, the concept of multiculturalism undermines the idea of God in the charter being the Christian God. So that if it had been the Christian God in the preamble, and if that was clear, the interpretation of the charter would be very, very different from what we've experienced.
Yes.
So the fact that it is a multicultural God and not the Christian God That is what has made the Charter so viciously anti-Christian in terms of its application. So definitely, in that constitutional legal sense, multiculturalism has been very harmful to our Christian heritage. But even like in the cultural sense, like you say, just like, well, we don't want to say we're a Christian country anymore because we're a multicultural country. And that's kind of been part of the Liberal agenda, has been to change Canada's historic identity. They wanted to get us away from our historic identity, and they want to base our identity now on abstract universal concepts. Like instead of what we were before, now our identity is like tolerance, diversity, multiculturalism, these things, rather than the historic identity we had as a country, with our military prowess and, the ability to develop this major country in the northern part of the continent and all these kind of things that we used to consider to be our identity. Like back in the days when, the RCMP was one of the things as a kid we were proud of as Canadians.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
We had these specifically Canadian things that identified us that we were proud of. But now the Liberals don't want that anymore. They want these other kinds of more universal concepts.
And it's interesting that all of the things which they promote, and again, this is why I see a religious element in this, because multiculturalism, tolerance, and diversity are actually only veneers for intolerance. So when you say we're a multicultural society, you actually just mean we're not Christian. That's all that means. Right. And this, again, I thought about this. I was reading the introduction to Van Prinster's book on basically Christian politics in an age of revolution. And the publisher's note in the beginning made a comment just about how, well, tolerance is not really about tolerance. It's just an opposition to absolute truth claims.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, well, that was pithy and succinct. And I mean, I could have, in one of my rants, explained that, but that is what it is.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, and I think multiculturalism is the same thing. It's not actually a valuing of all cultures equally, because that's not even possible.
Yeah.
Like, you have to prioritize, like, hey, are we going to have Sharia law? Are we going to have secular law, whatever that is?
Yeah.
Are we going to have multicultural God? Like, what's it going to be?
I don't know. It seems like it's also just a really cynical attempt to destroy Christianity.
Yeah.
Because they don't believe in Vishnu and they don't believe in Allah.
No.
But they're willing to use those things to destroy the Christian identity.
Yes.
So it's almost like that scene. Are you a C.S. Lewis fan? Chronicles of Narnia. There's that scene in the last battle where you have the character says that, oh, Tash and Aslan, they're just the same. They're all the same. And what he's really saying is that neither of them exist. Doesn't believe in either of them, but he's using this as a tool to manipulate the people. I kind of get the sense that that's what's going on. It's just a real cynical, hey, look at all the good things. We get to meet people from different cultures, and there's great food everywhere, and like that's the selling card. But it's really just, it's really just cynicism. Now, what happens if you actually get a Muslim majority and they try to bring Sharia in? Like they wouldn't have any way to stop that, but. I don't think they expect that to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean,
there's a giant 300
they should
foot.
probably close the borders.
And if they don't want that to happen, that'd be a good idea.
Yeah. So, Michael, maybe something you just mentioned there. I'm just curious from your perspective, because you've written a lot about Canada's Christian identity, historically speaking. And you are very much, as I understand, advocate for Alberta succession. But before we go right into that, maybe what is when you think of Canada, I'm assuming that you do have some fond memories of Canada as a nation and a vision of what was once a Christian nation. What are some things that come to your mind from just your own experience? That you maybe miss or lament that we have lost or forsaken? It's kind of a personal question, but
yeah. Well, like I'm older than you guys.
Yeah.
So like I remember before the charter, I was in high school when they brought in the charter. I remember, we used to sing "God Save the Queen" in schools and things like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, here's a funny story. This is before the charter, of course. When I was in, I think it was grade 9, I was in junior high. Anyway, this is. We were called down for a school assembly. Like, all the students were brought to the gym for an assembly to hear an evangelist one time. I think it was 1979. I was 14 or something. And, it was an interesting story because here was a guy who had been brought up in a Christian family, as an adult, he went into crime. He got stabbed. So he had this huge scar on his stomach. So he'd lift up his shirt and show us his scar. And as kids, we thought this was so cool. Anyway, he went through his testimony and how, he ended up repenting and turning back to Christ. And it was a really interesting story. And, the principal of our school brought every student together to hear this evangelist. Now, if a principal did that today, not only would he be fired, but he'd be up against human rights charges at least, if not something else.
Yeah.
But that was something, we didn't think anything weird, strange about that. We just thought that was really cool. We got to hear this guy. That's, say, in the age of the charter, that would not be possible, but before the charter. So, like I said, I mentioned the RCMP before. That's something we were proud of. We were proud of Canada's military. That was before Trudeau decided to start dismantling it. Canada did major things in both world wars and in between. So yeah, personally, I love Canada, and most people in Alberta who are in favor of independence, we love Canada. We just see that it's gone in the wrong direction for several decades, and not by accident. I mean, it's for me, I put a lot of the blame on Pierre Trudeau. He's the one who brought in a lot of the changes to get the country in the wrong direction, the charter being one of the big changes. And the Liberals in general have kept the country going in that direction. And so we see independence as, it's kind of like the lifeboat. We're getting out of this kind of sinking country, and independence can be a lifeboat, and we can save at least ourselves.
Well, I'd like to hear you expand upon that. I recently articulated some of these things online. A lot of people from the West thanked me as an Ontarian for sympathizing with your plight. So I will say I'm cheering you on, and save us a seat.
I hear there's a lot of land out there. Is that true?
Yeah. But the paradigm that I focused on was self-defense. And what people fail to grasp is that if you don't have a shared understanding of the magnitude of the corruption and even the spiritual element in this and the depravity of the situation, if you think that Albertans are just a little upset that some of the oil money goes to eastern provinces, you have no understanding of you don't really understand the issue. You don't understand how severe they consider it to be. And for me personally, if I was an Albertan, I would be appealing to the Protestant doctrine of the lesser magistrates, and I would be circling the wagons as a legitimate means of self-defense and self-preservation. It's not just about wanting more money and lower taxes and cheaper gas. Yes, economics is related to human flourishing, and it does matter. And funding a corrupt state that is so depraved and so out of control as ours is a good move. But there are more fundamental issues. So when did you, make the transition to committed Alberta secessionist? If you don't mind saying.
Actually, originally I became interested in the early 1980s when Pierre Trudeau brought in the National Energy Program. That was brought in at the end of 1980. I had been interested in international politics a bit as I was in my early teens, I guess. But I didn't really pay much close attention to Canadian politics. But when Trudeau brought in the National Energy Program, I was living in Calgary, going to high school in Calgary, and that was very, very harmful for Alberta. And Calgary is the oil capital of Canada, the main oil center for Alberta. And so a lot of people were losing their jobs and businesses were being shut down. So I kind of got swept up in the anti-Trudeau sentiment at that time. And I joined my first political party, which was the Western Canada Concept Party of Alberta. They had just won a by-election in February of 1982. It was the first time a separatist candidate had ever been elected in Western Canada. So it was just kind of this euphoria of us having to fight back against Trudeau. So my first experience and interest in the independence movement then was the early 1980s. And I remained a little bit active during the mid-80s, not heavily active, but a little bit. But what changed everything, though, with the independence movement in Alberta in the 1980s was Preston Manning created the Reform Party of Canada in the late 1980s. And the Reform Party of Canada was a very credible party. And the original motto was "The West wants in." The Reform Party wanted to reform Canada so that the interests of Western Canada could be heard in the national government for the first time. And so, I was kind of marginally involved in the Reform Party in its early years and things like that. But I didn't become really interested in the independence movement in Alberta until Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015. I mean, that was a turning point. We had Stephen Harper had been prime minister for about 9 years. He was an MP from Calgary. He was originally a Reform Party MP, so he was very familiar with the concerns of Western Canada, and Western Canadians trusted him. But when Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015, I knew that this was a turning point, and especially, he started bringing in his climate change policies, which were hurting Alberta very severely. And when he was reelected in 2019, that led to the rise of what was called the Wexit movement of that time. And I went to many of their meetings, so it just kind of took off from that, especially from the election of Justin Trudeau. So I got very involved again. So I was interested as a teenager. It kind of faded away for a while because of the Reform Party was defending our interests, and then it came back again with Justin Trudeau. That's my story, and that's a story of other people who've been interested in the independence movement.
Mm-hmm.
So I was actually, I didn't become a Christian until I was 19. So I was actually involved in the independence movement before I even became a Christian originally. So.
Wow. And so what is your kind of elevator pitch when you come across Albertans, and you're making the case? Do you appeal to the cultural issues, or is it economic, or is it everything? Like, what is your kind of pitch for Alberta succession?
Like my fundamental argument is a historical argument. Like many Albertans are patriotic Canadians, as I mentioned, and many of them say, we know things are bad for us right now, but we need to reform Canada. Let's fix Canada. And my argument is, we did try to fix Canada. We spent several decades trying to fix Canada. The Reform Party was the biggest example. Like, that was what the Reform Party was all about. That we weren't having our voice heard in Ottawa. And in Alberta, Alberta voted overwhelmingly for the Reform Party in 1993 and 1997, where we had the Reform Party. And we sent most of our MPs down there to get things fixed, and they were ignored. And then, of course, the Reform Party became the Canadian Alliance. Again, we voted overwhelmingly for the Canadian Alliance. And still, our concerns as Westerners were ignored. The other major initiative we had from the 80s and for quite a while afterwards was the Senate reform movement. And that was brought up earlier, because many Albertans believe, and many Westerners believe, that we could fix the Senate so that, along the lines of the American Senate, so that our regional interests can be represented in the national government. That's what the United States Senate does so well, because, they have representation by population in the House of Representatives, and then they have representation by state in the Senate. So you have a balance between the two. So if we reformed our Senate, and the popular idea was a triple E Senate, so that'd be a Senate that was elected with equal numbers from each province and with effective powers. Those are the three E's. A triple E Senate would have enabled Western provinces to have our voice heard within the national government. And so it would tie the country together, because you'd have representation by population in the House of Commons, and you'd have representation by region or province in the Senate. So you'd have a balance there. So we wanted to have that. We wanted to get that kind of fixture. So the Triple E Senate movement was very powerful, and it worked within the Reform Party as well. And actually, even Stephen Harper, believed in Senate reform. And when he was Prime Minister, he actually worked to try and do Senate reforms incrementally. He brought in, he proposed various bills in the House of Commons and the Senate to reform the Canadian Senate. I mean, he wanted to have senators elected. And actually, we have that in Alberta, where we would have Senate candidate elections, and then the winners of that election would be recommended to the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister has the power to appoint the senators, right? We haven't been able to change that. But what we can do is recommend certain people to the Prime Minister to appoint who have won election. And so we've had a number of senators in Alberta who were appointed. First, Brian Mulroney appointed at least one, and then Stephen Harper would appoint people from Alberta who had won those elections. So that was kind of an incremental change towards electing our senators, and he wanted that for every province. Stephen Harper was trying to bring in laws so that every province would have elections, and then those people would be recommended to the Prime Minister, for appointment. But to make a long story short, there was Quebec challenged one of those laws at Quebec Court of Appeal, and so Stephen Harper, to preempt that, he did a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada, because he wanted to be the one asking the questions at the Supreme Court of Canada. And the Supreme Court ruled that the kind of changes that Harper wanted to implement, he could not do without a constitutional change. And so that kind of killed the Senate reform movement. That was in 2014. So anyway, our two main efforts to reform Canada, with the Reform Party of Canada and Senate reform, they came to dead ends. There was just no way that we could reform the country the way we would like to, so that we could feel that we're part of this country. And so if we can't reform it, our next best choice is to get out. So when people say, well, we got to, so many Albertans realize that things aren't good for us here and we need changes, but we have tried so hard for so many decades to change things, and we just ran into a brick wall. So our only remaining alternative is to become independent. So that's kind of my main line of argumentation for Alberta independence.
That's really helpful. And it's so, if I'm understanding you correctly, then it's systemic problems that are long-standing. And it's interesting that even those, like listening to Pierre Poilievre saying, it's never going to happen, and people dismissing, or I mean, even Danielle Smith trying to, there's many things I admire about your premier as well. And I will say that with all respect. But the people, even like her, who are, sympathetic to the movement in some ways, their proposal to kind of appease the movement is kind of, we're going to get a pipeline.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, but
it doesn't get to the root of
that's not the root of the problem is that we don't have the autonomy to do this. Like, oh, don't worry, the feds are going to let us do this. It's like, no, we don't want the feds to have any control over whether we do this. Like, and no one, from what I've understood, what I've heard, at a federal level, no one is really dealing with those systemic issues. And it almost feels like an intentional framing of a. Are
you telling me the federal government is unwilling to relinquish some of its power? I can't even believe that.
Yeah.
Who ever heard of such a thing?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that is the problem. It's like the pipeline and more kind of an economic autonomy is good, but if there's not structural changes, we could run into this problem and many more down the line. And is your position? I mean, my understanding is that in theory, the Confederation is supposed to function with a degree of provincial autonomy. Well, not just a degree, but a high degree. And the kind of not the social contract, the legal contract, but I guess even on a popular level, the understanding was that we do have that. But I guess what you're saying is, in important ways, there isn't. Now, does this go back to Confederation, or is this later legal developments which kind of transferred power to the federal government, which was not originally there?
Like a lot of independent supporters will point back right to Confederation, because Western Canada, like especially the Prairie provinces, have had grievances with Canada, right from the very beginning. Okay. But for me personally, I begin with Pierre Trudeau, because every large country is going to have regional difficulties. That's just the nature of a large country with different regions. And Canada had that, and we were able to work through that to a large degree. But Pierre Trudeau came into power with a different vision of Canada. He wanted to centralize power in the federal government. Like he wanted to fight against Quebec nationalism. Like that was one of his main reasons for getting involved in politics. And so, because Quebec at that time, there was Quebec nationalism, it was moving towards separatist support for separation. Trudeau thought the way to have unity was to tie the country together more tightly under the power of the federal government. And actually, this ties in with the Charter itself. And this is one of the reasons the Charter was opposed by the premiers, was because the Charter itself is like a national institution, and the province's legislation would be judged by the Supreme Court of Canada as a national institution. And what's interesting too, actually, is just in January of this year, Ted Morton, who used to be a political scientist at the University of Calgary for decades, and then he became a cabinet minister in Alberta's government a few years ago. He's not right now, but he wrote a column for the National Post explaining how the Charter over the years has worked to reduce provincial powers. And this is actually one of the things that Trudeau wanted, by having a national institution in Ottawa that judges provincial legislation and can strike down provincial legislation. That actually erodes provincial power over a period of time, like over several decades. The Supreme Court has been able to strike down various pieces of provincial legislation, and that has weakened the provinces in relation to the federal government over a series of decades. And this was actually part of Trudeau's intention. The Charter itself would be a centralizing document, something that would tie the country more to the federal government to get, like he wanted a centralization of power. And it's incremental again. Like it's not something like we adopted the Charter the next day, the Supreme Court's in control of everything, but it has happened incrementally. And that was part of Trudeau's vision. Like, even though I say Pierre Trudeau rules Canada from the grave, he's been dead for 25 years, but his vision of Canada is still being implemented by the Supreme Court on the basis of the Charter. Every year, various decisions will incrementally make the country more and more centralized. So even though like I say, there are people in the independence movement who blame Confederation and things right from the beginning. Me personally, I start with Pierre Trudeau and the vision that he had. I mean, Trudeau, I consider him to be basically an evil genius because he was perhaps one of the smartest prime ministers we ever had. He accomplished much of his goals, and the charter was his biggest one, but he had several other policies that he accomplished that pushed us in a bad direction, including the centralization of power and the proliferation of left-wing ideas and other things like that. So for me personally, I blame it on Pierre Trudeau.
So how did that power balance work before the charter? So if let's say it's 1950, one of the provinces makes some legislation, makes some new laws, the federal government doesn't like it. Did they have any recourse to fight against it? How did that work before the charter? How was there central? Yeah, go ahead.
No, like originally, the federal government has what was called the power of disallowance. I mean, technically, they still have it. So in the first few decades, the federal government has the power to disallow provincial legislation. And they did use that up until the 1940s. Actually, I think they last used it against Alberta because Alberta had the social credit government in the 1930s that tried to bring in financial reforms that were part of federal jurisdiction. And so the federal government could actually just disallow provincial legislation. But over time, the federal government stopped using that. Part of that was it was very offensive to Quebec because Quebec did not like the idea of the federal government having the power to, disallow its legislation. And so the federal government kind of backed off and stopped using that. Like technically it's still there, but they don't use it. And I don't think they would want to use it because of the offense it would cause to Quebec. So, but we still had individual rights protected in the sense, like actually another thing that the social credit government in Alberta did that was bad was our premier was William Aberhart, and he was being criticized heavily in the press. So he brought in a law that would somehow force the press to sometimes print his particular perspective on an issue. And the Edmonton Journal fought that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck that down. Like even though we didn't have a charter of explicitly enumerated rights, we did have freedom of the press in a different sense. And the Supreme Court had the powers to strike down government laws, that would work against our individual rights. So we just had a different system. Our rights were protected, and there were ways that the federal government could deal with provinces. But generally speaking, it wasn't as centralized as it is now under the charter.
It's interesting. It's interesting that the pattern that's emerging, from this conversation is that with the rejection of Christianity and the Christian worldview, is also the rejection of other God-ordained jurisdictions, or, Kuyper would say spheres, and the consolidation of all authority in one sphere, namely the state. Leviathan, and even as the point of unity. Yeah. So the concept of unity in a Christian society, I mean, there are many things which contribute to your identity and your sense of belonging and unity with your neighbor. It begins with your parents, right? Your parents, your siblings, probably your church community, that you are one in Christ. Your physical neighbors, which no one is even aware of these days. Your city, and then your province, and then like my experience growing up, I didn't know anything about politics because it was completely irrelevant to me, to my experience. 2 kilometers down a dirt road in Cavan, Ontario, like. I knew my neighbors. I knew my church community. I knew the guys I went to school with. There were some world events that happened. Remembrance Day was probably one of the biggest civic, not holidays, but points of remembrance. Like this was a huge cultural thing in our mind, and church on Sundays. Like that was my life. But it's interesting with the rejection of Christian beliefs that all of that goes away. Mm-hmm. Like you're not even an individual in the sense that we understood ourselves. The family unit is destroyed. You even mentioned in your book that the sexual revolution was a revolution of the family. Like a lot of the groups that opposed the sexual revolution, it was a pro-family, movement as well. Well, these things are inseparable. And anyways, just a comment on what you're saying. It's legally and even in the consciousness of our society that the individual and the family and the church and even your just actual community, they all kind of disappear. Yeah. And everything is transferred to the state, and even the point of our national identity now becomes the state. and that's a sad, shallow thing.
Yeah, I guess this kind of brings us to that apostasy point that you're talking about. So as we have apostatized, then this is the inevitable consequence of that.
Yeah. Instead of God, like God in his kingdom is the totalizing principle and reality. But when you don't have God in the kingdom, it becomes something else.
And I'm just reading the Brothers Karamazov right now, and there's this great part at the beginning where I forget which character's even talking about it, but he's talking about the love for men and the love for mankind. And he says, the more I love mankind, the less I love individual men, because it's easier just to love, an abstract idea of mankind without actually loving your neighbor. But I think that's what happens when you apostatize, when you don't see your neighbor as made in the image of God. You can go on and on about how we're doing this for mankind and human rights and all this stuff, but you actually don't care about individual people.
You can have the brotherhood of men and the guillotine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Here comes the tumbril.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So maybe to close, we're kind of keeping you over here, what we plan to, but if you were, Michael, if you were to, obviously, I think we would all agree probably what Canada needs is revival. Like we need a spiritual renewal. At this point, a structural change can't fundamentally alter our nation or restore it, because those things are the outworking of an actual a living faith, a worldview that people actually believe and embody and this type of thing. But apart from a revival, which we all pray for in our churches, our families, our communities, and even our nation, what are maybe 2, 3, 4 things that Canada needs to change? If you were granted the dictatorial powers, tomorrow, like what are the things that need to happen yesterday in Canada?
Well, like I've never really thought about that way before.
Okay.
I mean, I was just really, I would really want to emphasize, like you say, without a grassroots revival, like without people in mass turning to the Lord, like nothing that we do structurally can work.
Yeah.
But that aside, if I could do 1 or 2 things, we would need a new constitution that would, be more explicitly recognize God and his law. That'd be something that's very important. And also, decentralization of power to the provinces and much more favorable pro-family policies from the government and getting rid of any kind of anti-Christian policies. But so there are things along those lines, but the most important thing, like you say, is revival. And even in the Alberta Independence movement, there's a lot of Christians involved in it. And a lot of us realize that Alberta Independence is not a solution if we don't turn back to God. Like if Alberta becomes independent and just stays a secular society and turning away from God, that will not ultimately be successful at all. I mean, we're just doing what we can in the circumstance that we're in, but realizing that without a revival from God, like an independent Alberta will just sink, just like Canada would as well without Alberta.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's a better way of framing it, is more positive. What if there was revival? What if there was a huge outpouring of God's Spirit and repentance among our countrymen? And then the question is asked, like, how do we fix this place? This place is really screwed up, and it sounds like we would need to go back legally to the beginning, a new constitution, because there's landmines built into the present one. The separation of powers, the decentralization, abolish the income tax. Let's go over that. I think you need to part of the reason I'm an advocate for Western succession is it might sound somewhat suicidal, but I think we need to starve the state. And I think that it would be, I acknowledge that if Alberta is successful, it will be bad for Ontario. And so I say that soberly, but it's like almost all of these issues are perpetuated by money.
Yeah.
And if the state did not have the money that it has, or you know what I mean? I mean, they'll just print
the charade would end quicker.
It would end a lot quicker.
If we didn't have all your money.
Yeah.
Could you guys just stop sending that over here, please?
Yeah. Well, hey, that was very helpful, and your books have been so helpful. We're gonna link to some of those. And where could people find you if they want to read more? Should we send them to your website or?
Like my website is one alternative. The other place is the place that sells my books online is actually a homeschooling supply organization called Merchant Ship, and it's based in a small town in Alberta.
Oh.
And so the website is just merchantship.ca. And so if they go to merchantship.ca, like I say, they sell a bunch of stuff, but if you search my last name, it'll bring up my books. So that's probably the easiest single place to get my books is merchantship.ca. But my website is available too, but it's pretty rudimentary, but it has that kind of information on it too.
That's fantastic.
Excellent.
Well, thank you so much for making time to speak with us tonight, Mike. We really appreciate that.
Been a great pleasure.
I'm glad to be with you guys. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, in light of the last point we made there, I'm going to leave us with this from Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. We'll see you next time on the Dominion Podcast.